DLC. The biggest evil ever brought upon the games industry. Or is it? DLC isn't a bad thing. Not inherently anyway. What's so bad about the extra content for games that we love that helps to keep them fresh and exciting even long after their initial release? What could possibly make something like that bad? Well, at the risk of sounding like some kind of fucking communist, money. Well, let's say corporate greed. No wait, that makes me sound like more of a communist. And that's why today we're going to be looking at the long-term DLC based investment fund that is Paradox Grand Strategy. I've said it multiple times in the past and I'll probably be saying it multiple times in the future. If these guys didn't make such god tier games, I would hate them. My problem with their grand strategy games is far from the fact that they're not enjoyable, because they are incredibly so, but more the way that they sell the DLC that comes along with them. Yes, it goes on sale pretty often, and sure, you might not need to buy all of them either, but Paradox does have a bit of a problem when it comes to selling reasonably priced expansions, and evidently, reasonably priced base games as well. And while I think that the DLC policy does come with its positives, it's hard to ignore the negatives that it brings with it. It's clear from the state of launch titles like Imperator Rome that Paradox want you to be buying their DLC when it comes out later, and they know how to make you buy it. Firstly, I'd like to begin with the positives that Paradox's DLC model brings about, and yes, there are a few. First of all, and I guess this is more a critique of the video games industry as a whole, it does ensure that their games aren't riddled with microtransactions and other in-game or cosmetic purchases. Yes, I know that there are skin packs for units and such, but it's nothing major and it's not really necessary, especially when you can't flex your cosmetics on other players. Another factor, which you might argue is probably the main reason that there isn't a load of microtransactions in their games, is because of the genre and that it's most commonly played in single player. The grand strategy genre doesn't really allow for loot boxes or pay to win, especially in single player when you could just use console commands. I mean, unless they added pay to win in multiplayer EU4 where you can pay for development or something, but surely not even fucking EA would do something like that. Or maybe they would. This is EA we're talking about. The other and probably bigger positive is that it means that their games are receiving plenty of content and pretty consistent updates well after their release. Games like EU4 and CK2 that have been around for many years are still getting new content and new patches, which helps to keep these games fresh and interesting even after all this time. This, however, is also arguably part of a pretty big negative, because going by the rather lackluster launch versions of Hearts of Iron 4 and Imperator Rome, it seems that Paradox are purposefully making their games rather stale and bare bones on launch in order to flog DLC for it down the line. So really, that's about all the positives I can say for the way they handled their DLC. And one is kinda not really because of the DLC policy itself, and the other is also kind of a negative. Speaking of negatives, let's get into that side of it, shall we? Firstly, let's talk about probably the most obvious issue, the price. Because of the price point of their DLC, Paradox games are very difficult to get into for newcomers because of all the DLC you'll need to get to keep up to date with everyone else. This is especially a problem when Paradox is still charging $40 USD for the base games of EU4 and CK2, games that are 6 and 7 years old respectively. Oh, you can just buy the base game and then the DLC later. Not really, no you can't. You ever tried to play base EU4? Have you? Not only that, but if you've only got the base game, you're basically just playing a game from years ago. Yes, there's still all of the free patches that come with the DLC packs, but you're missing out on a swath of features locked behind that paywall, which is only going to force your hand to shell out some cash if you want the true experience. I mean, look at this shit. I know a fair amount of that is extra content packs, but that's a lot of goddamn money to have to shell out to be able to play what would be the definitive version of the game. As previously mentioned, Paradox seem to have a tendency to hold back content from initial releases of their games in order to sell it down the track as DLC. This is my biggest problem with their DLC policy. A clear example of this is Imperator Rome. While I personally feel that it was pretty harshly criticized for what it was, this game does not stack up to EU4 or CK2 or HOI4. There's not a lot of doubt that eventually it might, as more DLCs and updates roll out. But that's gonna come with a price tag. Imperator wasn't the only one. HOI4 and Stellaris weren't exactly classics on launch either. It seems like after a while, once the DLCs and updates come out, we forget how janky some of these games are on launch, after we've already paid to fix them. I mean, maybe they haven't gone too far yet. It's not like they're locking off playable nations or religions behind DLC or something. Oh wait, they did that in CK2, didn't they? For fuck's sake, Paradox. This sort of thing is by far my biggest gripe with the way that Paradox peddle their DLC. It may have flown back in 2012 or 2013 when this scale of grand strategy was still new to us, but it doesn't fly anymore. Intentionally locking off content from a base game in order to sell it to you later is pretty fucking filthy on their part. Look, you can argue that the price tag is less of an issue for people who have been playing the game basically since launch. I mean, you'd be spending more on a WoW or RuneScape membership subscription over 6 or 7 years than you would buying all of the EU4 or CK2 content. But where does that leave newcomers? The people that have to shell out over $200 to keep up with everyone else? And setting up games from launch to more or less be a long-term DLC investment fund? That ain't it, chief. Paradox certainly aren't the only company that sells DLC like this. I don't want to imply that it's only them and that everyone else in the industry is a saint and DLC is always perfect in practice because, well, EA exists. I mean, the other day I was considering trying to get into Civilization 6 again, and yeah, even on sale, that didn't fucking happen. Probably one of the biggest factors I would take into why Paradox so easily get away with this is exclusivity. Look at some of the biggest DLC offenders outside of EA's grasp. The latest Civilization games, some of the simulator titles, and obviously, Paradox Grand Strategy. The big thing that all of these kinds of games have in common is a lack of a real competitor in the market. When you don't have anyone pushing you and keeping you reasonably priced and on your toes, you can just do whatever the hell you want, really. I mean, let's be real. What genuine alternative is there to Paradox Grand Strategy? Age of Civilizations? Okay, dumbass. Again, DLC is not inherently evil. It can bring more content and vitality to a game to extend its lifetime and relevance long after its initial release. And this is what Paradox have done with their games. Years after release, their games are still receiving updates and new content, and there's still a shitload of fun. Not all of it is evil on Paradox's part either. In multiplayer, as long as one player has all of the DLC, then everyone else in the game gets it too. The issue is that these games are far more commonly and more efficiently played than single player. The problem is when the game is new. Look at Imperator. Are you gonna sit there and honestly try and tell me that they're not holding off content to be sold as DLC later? Because if you are, you're a muppet. Does this make me hate Paradox? It's hard to say. I certainly don't hate their games. Paradox Grand Strategy is incredible and I've invested many hours into it already. It's their DLC policy that I don't like. I understand that they're a company and they need to make money. As previously discussed, the grand strategy genre does not really allow for in-game cosmetics or microtransactions in order to make them that money, so having a big-ass DLC lineup fills that void, I suppose. And while it does have its positives in that it has allowed games like EU4 and CK2 to stay relevant and updated even to this day, I feel that the price tag is unnecessary, and the way that they set about releasing their games more or less as a DLC investment fund is, well, scummy. What Paradox needs is a competitor. Someone who can release a game to the same scale and depth as their grand strategy titles. Someone who can do it at a more reasonable price with a more reasonable launch as well. Hopefully there's a developer out there willing to take the risk and dip their toes into this niche market, so that one day we won't have to keep drinking Daddy Johan's bathwater that is Paradox's DLC policy, should we want to continue to get our grand strategy fix. And until then, our only hope is to overthrow the Swedish government and install a communist dictatorship so that we can start distributing government-mandated DLC. Seriously, you give me a better idea.